I died on a Tuesday, though I would not understand this truth for several weeks to come. The realization came to me not with the dramatic flourish one might expect from such a revelation, but with the quiet certainty of morning light filtering through lace curtains, inevitable, gentle, and utterly transforming. My name is Lady Catherine Ashworth, Duchess of Ravenshollow, and I have been married to the Duke for 7 years, 3 months, and 14 days. I know this precisely because I have kept count of each morning I have awakened beside a man who has grown increasingly distant, increasingly cold, and increasingly eager for my absence from his daily concerns. What I did not know, until the moment my spirit began its slow separation from my failing body, was that my husband had been poisoning me with the methodical precision of a clockmaker and the tender care one might show a dying garden. The morning of my death began, as so many others had in recent months, with a peculiar weakness in my limbs and a strange metallic taste that lingered no matter how much bergamot tea I consumed. Margaret, my lady's maid, had commented with growing concern about the pallor of my complexion and the way my wedding ring now slipped so easily from my finger that she had taken to wrapping thread around the band to keep it in place. The irony was not lost on me, even then, that the symbol of my marriage required artificial support to remain where it belonged. The Duke, Charles Augustus Ashworth, had departed early that morning for what he claimed was urgent business in London, though I noticed he took with him only his smallest valise and none of the papers that typically accompanied his legitimate ventures. Through my bedroom window, I watched his carriage disappear into the October mist that clung to our estate like a secret unwilling to be told. Something in the way he had kissed my forehead before leaving, with what seemed almost like farewell rather than the casual affection of a brief separation, should have warned me. But I was already so weakened, so constantly fighting the fog that had settled over my thoughts, that I mistook his unusual tenderness for renewed concern for my health. Miss Evangeline Thorne arrived for her tutorial with our ward, little Timothy, at precisely 9 o'clock, as was her custom. I had hired her 6 months prior upon the recommendation of the vicar's wife, who praised her education and her circumstances as a genteel woman fallen upon modest fortune due to her father's untimely death. She was perhaps 25 years of age, with the kind of understated beauty that might be overlooked in a crowded room, but which, upon closer observation, revealed itself to be rather striking. Her dark hair was always arranged with meticulous care, and her gray eyes held an intelligence that made her an excellent governess, but also, I would later realize, an excellent conspirator. That morning, as I attempted to review the household accounts in my sitting room, I could hear the soft murmur of her voice drifting up from the library below, where she conducted Timothy's lessons. There was a musical quality to her speech that I had always found soothing, though lately I had begun to notice that her voice carried differently when she spoke to the servants, with more authority than her position should have warranted, and with the comfortable familiarity of someone who expected her words to be both heard and obeyed. The first wave of what I now know was the final crisis came upon me just as the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 11. The numbers in my ledger began to swim before my eyes like fish beneath the surface of a dark pond, and the pen slipped from my fingers with such suddenness that ink splattered across my carefully maintained records. I called for Margaret, but my voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, lost in the vast spaces of Ravenshollow Manor like a prayer spoken in an empty cathedral. I managed to ring the bell beside my chair, though the effort left me breathless, and when Margaret arrived, her face immediately transformed with alarm. She was a good woman, loyal and observant, and I could see in her expression that whatever she saw in my appearance frightened her more than she wished to reveal. "My lady, shall I send for Dr. Pemberton?" she asked, already moving toward the writing desk where she kept paper for urgent correspondence. I wanted to say yes, wanted to demand that she summon not only our family physician, but perhaps a specialist from London, someone who might finally explain why a woman of 28 years, previously in excellent health, had been declining so mysteriously for months. But as I opened my mouth to speak, the room began to tilt at impossible angles, and darkness crept in from the edges of my vision, like spilled ink spreading across white paper. The last thing I remembered with perfect clarity was the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside my sitting room. Not Margaret's familiar hurried pace, but the measured steps of someone who moved through Ravenshollow Manor with the confidence of ownership. Even in my failing consciousness, I recognized those footsteps, though they should not have been there. The Duke had departed for London hours ago and would not return for 3 days. Or so I had been told. When I next became aware of my surroundings, I found myself in the most peculiar position imaginable. Standing beside my own bed, looking down at my motionless form with a mixture of confusion and growing horror. My body lay so still that I instinctively reached toward my own throat to check for breath, only to find that my hand passed through the figure on the bed as if I were made of morning mist. The revelation of my condition might have been more disturbing had I not been immediately distracted by voices from the corridor. Through the partially opened door of my bedroom, I could see 2 figures in intimate conversation. My husband, who was supposed to be halfway to London, and Miss Evangeline Thorne, who should have been conducting lessons in the library. They stood closer together than propriety would permit between a man and his employee, and there was something in their posture, in the way her hand rested upon his arm, that spoke of a familiarity that had developed far beyond the boundaries of their supposed relationship. "Is it finished?" Miss Thorne asked, her voice carrying a note of anxiety that I had never heard from her before. The Duke glanced toward my bedroom door before responding. "Doctor, Pemberton believes it will be a matter of hours. Her constitution has proved more resilient than expected, but the recent increase in dosage has achieved the desired effect." Dosage. The word hung in the air between them like a blade, suspended by the thinnest thread. I watched from my strange vantage point as understanding crashed over me with all the force of a winter storm against the cliffs. The mysterious illness, the gradual weakening, the metallic taste that had plagued my meals. It had not been the mysterious feminine malady that Dr. Pemberton had suggested, nor the nervous exhaustion that comes from managing a large estate. I had been systematically murdered by the man who had sworn before God and witnesses to cherish and protect me. "And you are certain that no suspicion will fall upon us?" Miss Thorne pressed, moving even closer to my husband until their bodies nearly touched. "My dear Evangeline," the Duke replied, lifting her gloved hand to his lips in a gesture so tender it made my spirit recoil. "Dr. Pemberton has already documented months of declining health. There will be grief, of course, and sympathy for the tragic loss of one so young, but no questions that cannot be answered. We have been most careful." They had been careful, indeed. As I stood there, invisible and forgotten, watching my husband plan my funeral while courting my replacement, I began to understand the full scope of their deception. The isolated location of Ravenshollow Manor, 3 miles from the nearest village. The gradual dismissal of servants who had served my family for years, replaced with individuals personally selected by Miss Thorne. The way my husband had discouraged visitors during my illness, claiming that I was too weak for company and too sensitive for excitement. They had created the perfect conditions for murder, disguised as the tragic but natural death of a delicate woman overcome by the burdens of her station. And they had very nearly succeeded. But as I watched them plan their future together over my dying body, something began to stir within my ethereal form. Not anger exactly, for anger is too simple an emotion for such a betrayal, but a determination that surprised me with its clarity and strength. If I was to be caught between worlds, neither fully alive nor properly dead, then perhaps there were advantages to such an existence that they had not considered. After all, there are some secrets that can only be discovered by those who are no longer bound by the limitations of the living, and some forms of justice that require a perspective unencumbered by earthly constraints. The Duke and Miss Thorne separated as footsteps approached from the main staircase. Dr. Pemberton, arriving to document my final moments and provide the medical authority that would transform murder into tragedy. I watched my husband transform his expression from that of a lover into that of a grieving widower, a performance so convincing that I might have been moved by it had I not just witnessed the truth. As the doctor entered my bedroom and approached my failing body, I found myself drawn toward the window where the October afternoon was painting Ravenshollow Manor in shades of amber and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The estate stretched out below me with its manicured gardens and ancient oak trees, its stables and guest houses, and the small family cemetery where generations of Ashworths lay beneath weathered stone angels. Soon I realized there would be a fresh grave there, marked with my name and dates that would tell only the smallest portion of my story. But graves, I was beginning to understand, are for bodies, and I was no longer entirely certain that my body and I were still the same entity. The dying sun cast long shadows across the grounds, and in those shadows I thought I saw movement, not the ordinary bustle of servants going about their duties, but something more purposeful, more deliberate. Other figures, perhaps, who like me existed in the spaces between what was and what should have been. The thought should have been frightening, but instead, it filled me with the first genuine hope I had felt in months. I was not, it seemed, alone in death any more than I had been alone in life. The difference was that in death, I might finally have the power to act upon what I had learned rather than simply endure it. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 4 times, and with each note, I felt myself becoming more solid in my ethereal form, more certain of my purpose. My husband and his lover believed they had silenced me forever, but they had merely freed me from the constraints that had kept me quiet for so long. The investigation of my own murder was about to begin, and for the first time since my wedding day 7 years ago, I held all the advantages. The transition from living woman to investigating spirit proved far less dramatic than the Gothic novels in my library had led me to expect. There were no chains to rattle, no doors to slam in supernatural fury, no mysterious writing appearing upon mirrors in desperate pleas for justice. Instead, I discovered that death had granted me something far more valuable than theatrical haunting abilities: perfect invisibility and the freedom to move through Ravenshollow Manor without the constraints of propriety, physical limitations, or the need to maintain the facade of the devoted wife. My funeral was conducted with all the solemn grandeur befitting a duchess, though I observed the proceedings with the detached fascination of someone watching a play in which they had once performed but could no longer influence. The Duke played his role as grieving widower with consummate skill, his eyes appropriately red-rimmed, his shoulders bearing the weight of profound loss with just the right degree of noble suffering. Miss Thorne naturally did not attend the service, as it would have been inappropriate for a mere governess to join the family in their private grief. Instead, she remained at the manor, ostensibly to care for little Timothy, though I suspected her true purpose was to begin the delicate process of establishing herself as the future mistress of the estate. The mourners who filled our small chapel were primarily my husband's associates from London, men of business and politics who offered their condolences with the practiced efficiency of those who view funerals as networking opportunities. My own family had been so systematically discouraged from visiting during my illness that few of them had realized the severity of my condition until they received news of my death. My younger sister Elizabeth arrived 3 days too late, her anguish at missing my final moments providing the only genuine emotion I witnessed during the entire affair. Watching Elizabeth weep over my closed casket, I attempted to comfort her in the ways available to spirits, though I quickly learned that the boundary between the living and the dead is far more complex than simply being seen or unseen. When I placed my ethereal hand upon her shoulder, she shivered and pulled her shawl closer, murmuring about the chill in the chapel. When I whispered her name, she turned her head as if she had heard something carried on the wind, but could not locate its source. The living, it seemed, could sense the presence of spirits, but could not quite bridge the gap to communication. This discovery filled me with both frustration and hope. If Elizabeth could sense me, perhaps others could as well, given the right circumstances and the proper motivation. The thought of eventually making contact with someone who could act upon my behalf in the physical world became the cornerstone of my developing strategy. Dr. Pemberton signed my death certificate with the efficient satisfaction of a physician whose diagnosis had been proven correct, listing the cause as heart failure brought on by a wasting disease of unknown origin. He expressed his sympathy to my husband with the gravity appropriate to losing a patient, though I noticed he avoided direct eye contact during their conversation, a detail that might have seemed insignificant to the living, but struck me as profoundly telling from my new perspective. After the funeral guests departed and the manor settled into its official period of mourning, I began my systematic investigation of the crime that had claimed my life. The advantages of being a ghost, I discovered, far outweighed the disadvantages when it came to gathering intelligence. Locked doors presented no barrier. Private conversations could be overheard without concern for discovery, and personal documents could be examined without fear of disturbing their arrangement. My first destination was my husband's private study, a room I had been discouraged from entering even during our happiest years together. Charles had always claimed it contained sensitive business documents that were inappropriate for feminine attention, an explanation I had accepted with the trusting naivety that I now recognized as one of my greatest weaknesses. The study was located in the oldest wing of Ravenshollow Manor, accessible only through a narrow corridor that connected to the main house through what had once been a medieval watchtower. The room itself was smaller than I had expected, dominated by a massive oak desk that had belonged to Charles's grandfather and lined with legal volumes that appeared more decorative than functional. But it was not the obvious contents of the study that captured my attention. It was the hidden compartment I discovered quite by accident when my ethereal form passed through what I had assumed was a solid wall. Behind a false panel concealed by a bookshelf devoted to agricultural texts, Charles had created a second office, one that contained the true records of his activities. Here were ledgers that documented debts far more extensive than anything reflected in our official household accounts, correspondence with moneylenders whose rates suggested desperation rather than routine business transactions, and contracts that revealed the true state of the Ravenshollow estate. We were, I realized with growing horror, completely bankrupt. The fortune that had attracted Charles to my family in the first place had been systematically gambled away over the course of our marriage through investments in railway schemes that existed only on paper, mining ventures in countries that proved to be entirely fictional, and an ongoing addiction to games of chance that had consumed not only his own inheritance, but every penny of my dowry and the majority of property that I had brought to our union. But even more disturbing than the evidence of financial ruin were the documents that outlined Charles's solution to our monetary crisis. In a folder marked with my initials were copies of insurance policies taken out upon my life, each one purchased from a different company over the past 2 years. Each one substantial enough to not only clear our debts, but to provide a comfortable living for my widower and any future wife he might choose to take. The dates of these policies corresponded exactly with the onset of my mysterious illness, a correlation that would have been obvious to anyone examining the timeline with a suspicious mind. The most damning evidence, however, was a letter addressed to Miss Thorne in Charles's own handwriting, dated just 1 week before my death. In it, he outlined their future together with the detailed planning of a military campaign, complete with a timeline for the appropriate period of mourning, the gradual introduction of Miss Thorne into society as a family friend who had provided comfort during his grief, and the eventual announcement of their engagement as a love match that had blossomed from mutual sympathy and shared understanding of loss. They had planned not only my murder, but my replacement with the methodical precision of clockwork, accounting for every social nicety and potential obstacle to their happiness. The letter concluded with assurances of Charles's devotion and a promise that once they were wed, Miss Thorne would never again need to concern herself with the uncertain position of a governess dependent upon the goodwill of others for her survival. Reading those words, I felt something within my spirit crystallize into a determination so fierce it seemed to warm the cold, ethereal form I now inhabited. They had not simply killed me for money, though the financial motive was certainly present. They had killed me for convenience, to clear the way for a love affair that had apparently been flourishing under my own roof while I slowly died in ignorance of their betrayal. The casual cruelty of it, the complete disregard for my humanity, ignited a fury that I had never experienced while living. But fury, I was learning, could be channeled into purpose when one had eternity to plan and the invisible mobility to gather information. If Charles and Evangeline believed they had committed the perfect crime, they had failed to account for the possibility that their victim might continue to take an active interest in seeing justice done. My exploration of the hidden study also revealed another crucial piece of information. Charles had not acted alone in conceiving this scheme. Among his correspondence was a series of letters from a London physician named Dr. Marcus Whitmore, a man I had never heard mentioned in our social circle, but who appeared to have provided both the poison used to kill me and detailed instructions for its administration. Dr. Whitmore's letters discussed the substance as if it were a medicine being prescribed for a legitimate patient, but the quantities and the specific timing of doses made it clear that this was no therapeutic treatment. The poison, according to Dr. Whitmore's clinical notes, was a form of arsenic that had been chemically altered to produce symptoms resembling a wasting disease, complete with the gradual weakening, digestive distress, and eventual organ failure that had characterized my final months. The beauty of this particular formulation, he noted with the professional pride of a craftsman, was that it mimicked so closely the pattern of several recognized feminine ailments that even an experienced physician would be unlikely to suspect foul play unless specifically testing for toxic substances. Dr. Pemberton, our family physician, had clearly been chosen for his willingness to accept the obvious explanation rather than pursue uncomfortable questions. Whether he had been deliberately misled or had chosen ignorance over investigation, I could not yet determine, but his failure to protect me was a wound that cut as deeply as the betrayal of my husband. As I prepared to leave Charles's secret study, I noticed movement in the courtyard below the narrow window. Miss Thorne was walking toward the stables, dressed not in the modest attire appropriate to a governess still employed in a house of mourning, but in a riding habit of deep blue velvet that I recognized as one of my own. She had apparently felt comfortable enough to begin appropriating my wardrobe even before the earth had fully settled upon my grave. Following her through the grounds of the estate, I watched as she made her way to a section of the stable that had been unused since my childhood, when my father had kept hunting horses there. Now, the old stalls had been converted into what appeared to be a temporary storage area for trunks and boxes that definitely did not belong to the current residents of Ravenshollow Manor. Miss Thorne unlocked one of these trunks with a key she wore on a chain around her neck, revealing an interior filled with documents, jewelry, and what appeared to be substantial amounts of cash money. But most intriguing were the letters bundled with ribbon in various colors, suggesting an extensive correspondence with multiple parties. As she selected several documents from the trunk, I was able to observe enough to understand that Miss Evangeline Thorne was not quite what she seemed. The letters she examined bore addresses from London, Paris, and even New York, written in languages that included French and what appeared to be German. For a governess supposedly reduced to accepting employment due to family misfortune, she demonstrated a remarkably sophisticated international network of correspondence. Moreover, the jewelry visible in the trunk was far too valuable for someone in her supposed circumstances, including pieces set with diamonds and emeralds that would have been appropriate for a duchess rather than a domestic employee. Watching her carefully sort through these materials with the efficiency of someone conducting business rather than reminiscing over personal mementos, I began to suspect that my murder had been orchestrated by someone far more professional than a mere governess who had fallen in love with her employer. Miss Thorne was clearly operating according to a plan that extended far beyond the boundaries of Ravenshollow Manor and involved resources that spoke of extensive preparation and significant financial backing. But if Miss Thorne was not what she appeared to be, then everything I thought I understood about my husband's betrayal required reconsideration. Had Charles been the architect of my death, or merely a willing accomplice in a scheme conceived by someone else? The distinction was crucial, because it would determine not only the scope of the conspiracy, but also the identity of others who might be at risk. As I pondered these questions, I became aware that I was no longer alone in my ethereal state. Standing at the edge of the stable yard, barely visible even to my ghostly perception, was another figure that seemed to exist in the same liminal space between life and death that I now inhabited. The figure was that of an elderly woman, dressed in the style of perhaps 30 years past, her gray hair arranged in the elaborate coiffure that had been fashionable during my childhood. She was watching Miss Thorne with the same intent focus that I had been applying to my investigation, and when she noticed my attention, she turned toward me with the expression of recognition that suggested she had been waiting for this moment. Without words, she gestured for me to follow her, leading me away from the stables toward a section of the estate that I had never fully explored. The old cemetery where previous generations of the Ashworth family lay buried beneath monuments that spoke of lives lived in times when honor and duty carried weight that modern society seemed to have forgotten. Among these weathered stones, she paused beside a grave marked with a name that made my ethereal heart skip: Lady Margaret Ashworth, beloved wife of the 4th Duke, taken by sudden illness in the 28th year of her life. The dates indicated that Lady Margaret had died nearly 50 years ago, but the circumstances described on her monument were disturbingly similar to my own. The elderly spirit turned to face me directly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "You are not the first Duchess of Ravenshollow to die under mysterious circumstances, my dear. Nor, I fear, will you be the last, unless we act swiftly to break a pattern that has continued far longer than any of us suspected. The revelation that my death might be part of a larger pattern of murders stretching back decades transformed my understanding of the situation entirely. If Lady Margaret spoke the truth, then Charles might not have been the mastermind of my death, but rather the latest in a series of dukes who had been manipulated into becoming widowers when their wives became inconvenient or when financial pressures required the solution that life insurance could provide. But if that were true, then Miss Thorne represented something far more dangerous than a governess who had seduced her employer. She might be part of an organization that specialized in arranging the convenient deaths of wealthy women, operating with the sophistication and patience that could only come from extensive experience and substantial resources. Standing there among the graves of women who might have been my sisters in victimhood, I felt the weight of responsibility settle upon my shoulders like a mantle of purpose. I had been granted this strange existence between worlds not merely to seek justice for my own death, but to prevent future murders and expose a conspiracy that had operated in shadows for longer than anyone among the living suspected. Lady Margaret smiled at me with the satisfaction of someone who had finally found an ally capable of understanding the true scope of the challenge we faced. "There is much you need to learn, Catherine, and very little time in which to learn it. But first, you must understand that the living cannot fight this battle alone. They need our help, our knowledge, and most importantly, our ability to access truths that the physical world has hidden." The grandfather clock in the manor house chimed midnight, marking the end of my first full day as a spirit, and the beginning of what I now understood would be a much larger and more complex investigation than I had initially imagined. But for the first time since my death, I felt not alone, but part of something larger than my individual quest for justice. The dead, it seemed, had their own society, their own purposes, and their own methods of achieving goals that the living could not accomplish on their own. And I was about to learn that becoming a ghost was not the end of my story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter in a battle that had been raging for decades without the knowledge of those it was designed to destroy. Lady Margaret's instruction in the art of being dead proved both more complex and more liberating than I had anticipated. Over the following weeks, as autumn deepened into the bone-chilling dampness of a Yorkshire November, she taught me that the spiritual realm operated according to its own logic, with rules that bore little resemblance to the physical laws that had governed my living existence. The most crucial lesson was that spirits could influence the material world, but only through careful application of focused intention and an understanding of the delicate threads that connected the seen and unseen realms. A door left slightly ajar could be pushed closed by concentrated thought. A letter placed carelessly near the edge of a desk could be encouraged to fall at precisely the right moment. Most importantly, the living could be made to sense our presence when their emotional state created openings in their usual defenses against the supernatural. Fear, guilt, and love, Lady Margaret explained, as we practiced in the conservatory, where I had once tended orchids that now bloomed untended in wild profusion. These emotions thin the barrier between worlds. When the living experience them intensely, they become temporarily accessible to our influence. This knowledge proved invaluable as I continued my investigation into the conspiracy that had claimed my life. Charles, I discovered, was particularly susceptible to spiritual interference when he was alone in his study late at night, reviewing the financial documents that outlined his precarious situation. During these sessions, when guilt over my murder warred with relief at his temporary financial salvation, I found I could manipulate small objects around him, creating disturbances that left him increasingly nervous and prone to mistakes. Miss Thorne, however, proved remarkably resistant to supernatural influence, a fact that Lady Margaret found deeply troubling. A living person who cannot sense the presence of spirits, she warned me, is either someone who has never experienced genuine emotion or someone who has been trained to resist our influence through methods that suggest extensive knowledge of our realm. The implications were sobering. If Miss Thorne had been prepared to encounter ghostly interference, it suggested that her organization, for I had become convinced that she was part of something larger than a simple romance gone murderous, had experience with situations where their victims might continue to pose problems after death. It was during one of my nocturnal investigations that I first encountered Dr. Edmund Blackwell. Though the circumstances of our meeting were far from the romantic introduction that novels would suggest, I was in Charles's study, attempting to manipulate his correspondence in ways that might reveal more about Dr. Whitmore's role in providing the poison, when I heard the sound of a carriage approaching the manor at an hour when no legitimate visitor would call. Through the window, I watched a tall figure emerge from a modest but well-appointed vehicle, carrying the leather case that marked him as a medical man. But this was not Dr. Pemberton, whose comfortable bulk and familiar gait I would have recognized immediately. This visitor was younger, perhaps 35 years of age, with the lean build and purposeful movement of someone accustomed to working under pressure. Even in the dim light of the carriage lamps, I could see that he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had earned his position through merit rather than inheritance. Charles received his visitor in the front hall with obvious reluctance, their conversation conducted in voices too low for normal hearing, but perfectly audible to my enhanced spiritual senses. The newcomer identified himself as Dr. Edmund Blackwell, recently appointed to investigate certain irregularities in medical practices throughout Yorkshire at the request of the Royal College of Physicians. "I'm afraid I don't understand the nature of your inquiry, Dr. Blackwell," Charles replied, with the careful politeness of a man who wished to appear cooperative while revealing nothing of substance. "My wife's illness was thoroughly documented by our family physician, and her death, while tragic, was hardly unexpected given her declining condition." Dr. Blackwell's response carried a note of professional skepticism that made my ethereal heart leap with hope. "I'm certain Dr. Pemberton provided excellent care within the limits of his understanding, Your Grace. However, recent developments in London have brought to our attention certain patterns in rural deaths that warrant closer examination. Specifically, cases where young women of good health have succumbed to mysterious wasting diseases that leave few traces for post-mortem examination." The careful phrasing of his statement told me everything I needed to know about Dr. Blackwell's true purpose. He was not conducting a routine review of medical practices. He was investigating a series of suspicious deaths, and my case had somehow attracted his attention. The realization that my murder had not gone entirely unnoticed by the authorities filled me with the first genuine hope I had experienced since my death. Charles, however, was clearly alarmed by the direction of the conversation. "Are you suggesting that my wife's death was somehow irregular? I can assure you that she received the finest medical attention available, and her condition was witnessed by numerous members of our household staff." "I'm suggesting nothing at this stage, Your Grace," Dr. Blackwell replied with the diplomatic firmness of someone accustomed to dealing with defensive nobility. "I am simply gathering information that may help us understand whether certain medical phenomena represent natural variations in disease progression, or whether they indicate patterns that warrant further investigation." Watching this exchange from my invisible vantage point, I found myself studying Dr. Blackwell with growing fascination. Unlike the other men who had moved through my life, he seemed to possess a quality of attention that suggested he might be capable of perceiving truths that others missed. His questions were carefully constructed to avoid giving offense while still extracting information, and his manner suggested someone who had learned to read people with the same precision he might apply to diagnosing illness. More intriguingly, as the conversation continued, I began to sense that Dr. Blackwell was aware of my presence in ways that Charles certainly was not. Several times during their discussion, his eyes moved toward the exact location where I stood, though he gave no obvious sign of seeing me. When I experimented with moving to different positions around the room, his gaze seemed to track my movement with the subtle accuracy of someone who was conscious of being observed but uncertain of the source. The interview concluded with Dr. Blackwell's request to examine my medical records and to speak with Dr. Pemberton about the specifics of my treatment. Charles agreed to these requests with the gracious reluctance of a grieving widower who wished to cooperate with official inquiries while protecting his privacy during a difficult time. But I could see the calculation behind his performance. He was weighing the risks of appearing uncooperative against the dangers of allowing too close an examination of circumstances he preferred to keep obscure. After Dr. Blackwell departed, promising to return within a few days to continue his inquiry, Charles immediately summoned Miss Thorne to his study. Their subsequent conversation confirmed my growing understanding that my murder had been planned and executed with far more sophistication than I had initially realized. This Dr. Blackwell represents a complication we had not anticipated, Charles said without preamble. His question suggests that someone has drawn connections between Catherine's death and similar cases elsewhere. Miss Thorne received this information with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to managing unexpected challenges. Dr. Blackwell has been investigating suspicious deaths throughout the North for several months, she replied. His attention was inevitable once he recognized the pattern. But his investigation need not concern us if we maintain our composure and provide no additional evidence for his suspicions. The casual way she discussed Dr. Blackwell's broader investigation told me that she had been monitoring his activities, further confirmation that her organization possessed resources and intelligence networks that extended far beyond Ravenshollow Manor. But more disturbing was her implication that there had been enough similar cases to constitute a recognizable pattern, meaning that many more women than just Lady Margaret and myself had fallen victim to this conspiracy. "What of Dr. Pemberton?" Charles asked. "Can we rely upon his continued cooperation?" Miss Thorne's smile was cold enough to chill even my ghostly form. Dr. Pemberton's gambling debts ensure his loyalty, and his reputation depends upon his diagnosis being accepted without question. He will provide whatever testimony supports our version of events. So Dr. Pemberton had not simply been careless or incompetent. He had been deliberately compromised, his silence purchased through blackmail rather than mere professional courtesy. The revelation added another layer of culpability to my murder, and suggested that their organization had been active in Yorkshire long enough to identify and corrupt the medical professionals whose cooperation they required. But their conversation also revealed a crucial weakness in their position. They were concerned about Dr. Blackwell's investigation, which meant that his methods posed a genuine threat to their operations. If I could find a way to assist his inquiry, to provide him with information that would confirm his suspicions, then perhaps justice might be achieved through legitimate channels rather than supernatural vengeance. The challenge, of course, was establishing communication with someone who existed entirely in the physical realm. Lady Margaret had taught me that strong emotional connections could create opportunities for contact, but Dr. Blackwell was a stranger who had no personal investment in my fate beyond his professional obligations. It was while contemplating this problem that I made a discovery that would transform both my understanding of the spiritual realm and my ability to influence events among the living. In the library where Miss Thorne conducted her supposed lessons with Timothy, I found evidence that she had been systematically studying texts related to spiritualism, mesmerism, and what contemporary scholars termed psychical research. The books were carefully hidden behind more conventional volumes on education and child development, but my ability to pass through physical barriers allowed me to examine materials that would have been impossible for a living person to discover. Among these texts were detailed instructions for conducting seances, methods for detecting spiritual presences, and most significantly, techniques for protecting oneself from supernatural influence. Miss Thorne, I realized, was not simply a criminal who happened to be operating in a world where ghosts existed. She was someone who understood the spiritual realm well enough to prepare defenses against it. This knowledge explained her resistance to my attempts at influence and suggested that her organization had encountered vengeful spirits before. But knowledge of an enemy's defenses also provided opportunities for someone clever enough to exploit their weaknesses. If Miss Thorne expected spiritual interference to follow certain patterns, then perhaps approaching the problem from an unexpected direction might catch her unprepared. My opportunity came sooner than anticipated. 3 days after Dr. Blackwell's initial visit, he returned to Ravenshollow Manor to examine my medical records and interview Dr. Pemberton. I positioned myself in Dr. Pemberton's office during their meeting, determined to find some way to influence the conversation in favor of truth rather than concealment. Dr. Pemberton's nervousness was immediately apparent to anyone with eyes to see it, though he attempted to mask his anxiety behind the pompous authority that some physicians adopt when their competence is questioned. He provided Dr. Blackwell with detailed accounts of my symptoms and treatment, all of which supported the narrative of a mysterious wasting disease that had resisted every therapeutic intervention. But as the interview progressed, I noticed that Dr. Blackwell was asking questions that probed beneath the surface of the official explanation. He inquired about specific symptoms that would have been consistent with arsenic poisoning, though he never used that term directly. He asked about the timing of my illness in relation to household changes, dietary modifications, and other factors that might have provided opportunities for the systematic administration of toxic substances. Most tellingly, he requested to examine samples of my hair and fingernails, materials that Dr. Pemberton claimed had been disposed of according to normal medical practice, but which I knew he had actually preserved in sealed containers hidden in his laboratory. The existence of these samples, which could provide definitive evidence of poisoning if properly analyzed, was information that only someone with knowledge of Dr. Pemberton's actual procedures could possess. It was at this crucial moment that I chose to act. Drawing upon everything Lady Margaret had taught me about focusing spiritual energy, I concentrated all my attention on the locked cabinet where Dr. Pemberton kept materials he preferred to keep private. With tremendous effort, I managed to cause the cabinet door to swing open with enough force to draw both men's attention. Dr. Blackwell's reaction confirmed my growing suspicion about his sensitivity to supernatural phenomena. While Dr. Pemberton sputtered about faulty latches and old hinges, Dr. Blackwell moved directly to the cabinet and began examining its contents with the focused attention of someone who recognized an opportunity when it presented itself. "These appear to be preserved tissue samples," he observed, holding up several of the containers I had hoped he would discover. "Standard practice would be to dispose of such materials after a reasonable period unless there were specific reasons for preservation." Dr. Pemberton's attempts to explain the samples as routine precautionary measures were unconvincing even to his own ears, and Dr. Blackwell's request to examine them using advanced analytical methods available in London created a level of panic that no innocent physician would have displayed. But the most significant moment came as Dr. Blackwell was preparing to leave with the samples that would provide the evidence needed to prove my murder. As he passed near the location where I stood, he spoke in a voice so low that only someone with supernatural hearing could have detected the words. "If you can hear me," he said without turning his head or giving any sign that he was addressing anyone other than himself, "then know that justice will be done. But I will need your help to ensure that all those responsible are brought to account." The realization that Dr. Blackwell was not only aware of my presence, but actively seeking my cooperation, transformed my entire understanding of the situation. Here was a living man who possessed both the professional expertise to prove my murder and the spiritual sensitivity to work with ghostly allies in pursuit of truth. For the first time since my death, I felt that the balance of power was shifting in favor of justice rather than concealment. Miss Thorne's organization might have extensive experience in covering their crimes, but they had never before faced the combined efforts of a determined investigator and a victim who refused to remain silent in death. The game, as Lady Margaret observed with satisfaction when I reported these developments, was finally beginning in earnest. And this time, the killers would discover that some secrets are impossible to bury, no matter how deep the grave or how careful the planning. Standing at the window of my former bedroom, watching Dr. Blackwell's carriage disappear into the November fog, carrying evidence that would expose the truth of my murder, I felt something I had not experienced since my wedding day. the certainty that the future held possibilities worth fighting for, even if that fight must be waged from beyond the boundaries of mortal life. The laboratory analysis of my preserved hair and nail samples provided the definitive proof that Dr. Blackwell had sought, though the results raised questions that extended far beyond the simple matter of my murder. The sophisticated chemical analysis available in London revealed not merely the presence of arsenic in my system, but a specific formulation that had been modified to delay absorption and mask the typical symptoms that might alert a competent physician to the possibility of poisoning. Dr. Blackwell shared these findings with me during what had become our evening conversations in my former sitting room, a ritual that had developed over the weeks following his initial discovery of my presence. He would arrive at Ravenshollow Manor each evening under the pretense of reviewing medical records with Dr. Pemberton, but would then spend hours in quiet discussion with what appeared to anyone observing to be empty air. These conversations had begun tentatively, with Dr. Blackwell speaking aloud his thoughts and observations while I experimented with methods of response. Lady Margaret had taught me that spiritual communication was most effective when the living participant possessed both emotional openness and intellectual acceptance of phenomena beyond normal experience. Dr. Blackwell, it turned out, possessed both qualities in abundance. His sensitivity to the spiritual realm, he explained, had developed during his medical training when he had been required to spend long hours with dying patients. The moment of death, he told me one evening as November rain drummed against the windows, is not the sharp transition that most people imagine. There is often a period where the soul seems to hover between worlds, and those of us who are present during these transitions sometimes develop the ability to perceive what others cannot. Learning to communicate with him had required patience from both of us, but we had gradually developed a system that allowed for detailed conversation. I could manipulate small objects to indicate yes or no responses to his questions, cause temperature changes that he could interpret as emotional reactions, and most remarkably, influence the formation of condensation on windows to create letters and words when the atmospheric conditions were favorable. But beyond these practical methods of communication, we had discovered something far more profound, a connection that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries between the living and the dead. When Dr. Blackwell focused his attention entirely upon our conversation, setting aside the rational skepticism that his scientific training encouraged, I found that I could share not merely information, but actual memories and emotions. The first time this deeper communication occurred, we were discussing the details of my poisoning when I was suddenly able to convey to him the complete sensory experience of my final morning. The metallic taste that had plagued my meals, the weakness in my limbs, the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong despite everyone's reassurances that I was recovering. Dr. Blackwell received these impressions with such clarity that he was able to describe symptoms I had never explicitly communicated, details that provided crucial medical evidence for his investigation. But this sharing of experience flowed in both directions. Through our spiritual connection, I began to understand Dr. Blackwell's own history and the personal motivations that drove his pursuit of justice with such unwavering determination. He had lost his young wife to circumstances remarkably similar to my own. A mysterious illness that had been attributed to feminine constitutional weakness, but which had never been properly investigated due to the social pressure to accept tragic deaths as divine will rather than human malice. Eleanor died 3 years ago, he told me one evening, his voice carrying the pain of grief that had transformed into purpose. She was 26 years old, in perfect health, married to a man whose gambling debts exceeded his ability to pay. Her death provided exactly the financial solution that her husband required, and the physician who attended her was known for his willingness to avoid uncomfortable questions in exchange for generous compensation. The parallel between Eleanor's death and my own was too precise to be coincidental. Dr. Blackwell's investigation had begun as a personal quest to understand what had happened to his wife, but had gradually expanded as he discovered that the pattern of convenient deaths among young wives was far more widespread than any individual case would suggest. There is an organization, he explained, sharing information that his official investigation had uncovered, that specializes in arranging solutions for men whose wives have become financial or social liabilities. They operate with extreme sophistication, maintaining networks of corrupted physicians, providing exotic poisons that mimic natural diseases, and offering services that appear entirely legitimate until one examines the statistical probability of so many young women dying from mysterious ailments. Miss Thorne, according to Dr. Blackwell's research, was not merely an individual criminal, but a representative of this larger enterprise. Her role was to infiltrate households where wives needed to be eliminated, establish herself in positions of trust and access, and then coordinate the various elements required for successful murder. The corrupted physician, the exotic poison, the social isolation that prevented outside interference, and the insurance policies that provided financial motive disguised as prudent planning. The organization recruits women who are intelligent, attractive, and socially adaptable, Dr. Blackwell continued, but who lack family connections or social position that might make their backgrounds subject to close examination. They are trained in the arts of seduction and household management, but also in more specialized skills, the preparation and administration of poisons, the manipulation of legal documents, and most significantly, the identification and exploitation of psychological weaknesses in their targets. Learning the scope of the conspiracy that had claimed my life filled me with a cold fury that seemed to strengthen my spiritual abilities. My death had not been a crime of passion or even simple greed, but a business transaction conducted by professionals who treated murder with the same casual efficiency that other enterprises might apply to the manufacture of textiles or the import of tea. But my growing anger was tempered by the deepening emotional connection I felt with Dr. Blackwell. Our evening conversations had evolved beyond the sharing of information into something that resembled courtship, though conducted under circumstances that no social convention had ever contemplated. We discussed literature, philosophy, and the great questions of existence with the intimacy of lovers, though we could never touch, never share physical presence, never experience the conventional expressions of romantic attachment. Yet what we shared seemed more profound than the physical romance I had known during my marriage. Dr. Blackwell saw me not as a possession to be protected or a social accessory to be displayed, but as an intellectual equal whose opinions and insights he valued. Our conversations revealed a meeting of minds and spirits that I had never imagined possible, a connection that seemed to prove that love could indeed transcend the boundaries of life and death. I find myself thinking, Dr. Blackwell admitted one evening, as we discussed the evidence that would be required to arrest not only Charles and Miss Thorne, but the larger organization they served, that this investigation has become something far more personal than my professional obligations would justify. I began this work seeking justice for Eleanor, but I continue it now seeking justice for you, and I am no longer certain that my motivations are entirely objective. His confession that our relationship had moved beyond the professional into the personal filled me with a joy that seemed to illuminate my ethereal form like candlelight. Here was a man who loved me not despite my ghostly state, but because of the unique intimacy that our spiritual connection allowed. He understood me more completely than anyone ever had during my living years, and I understood him with the clarity that comes from sharing consciousness rather than merely sharing conversation. But our growing attachment also brought complications that neither of us had anticipated. As our emotional connection deepened, I found myself becoming more solid, more present in the physical world in ways that were both wonderful and dangerous. Objects moved more readily at my touch. Temperatures fluctuated more dramatically in response to my emotions, and most significantly, I began to become visible to others besides Dr. Blackwell. The first person to see me was little Timothy, who had been my ward during Miss Thorne's supposed employment as his governess. Children, Lady Margaret explained, were naturally more sensitive to spiritual presence, but Timothy's ability to see and speak with me represented something beyond normal childhood perception. "Lady Catherine," he whispered one afternoon as he played alone in the library while Miss Thorne attended to correspondence. "Why are you so sad? And why does Miss Thorne pretend not to see you when you're standing right behind her?" His innocent question revealed that Miss Thorne was perfectly aware of my presence, but was maintaining her pretense of ignorance as part of her larger strategy. But it also meant that my spiritual activities were becoming visible to household members who might inadvertently reveal my existence to Charles or Miss Thorne before Dr. Blackwell's investigation was complete. The danger of premature discovery became acute when Elizabeth, my sister, arrived for what she believed would be a final visit to settle my personal effects and close the London house. Elizabeth had always been sensitive to atmospheres and emotional undercurrents, and her grief over my death had left her particularly vulnerable to supernatural contact. She sensed my presence almost immediately upon entering Ravenshollow Manor, though she initially attributed her awareness to the natural melancholy of visiting places associated with loss. But as she moved through the rooms where I had lived, touching objects that had been meaningful to me, our connection strengthened until she could hear my voice as clearly as if we were speaking across a drawing room. "Catherine," she whispered, standing in my former bedroom where my personal effects lay arranged as if awaiting my return. "Is that truly you, or am I losing my reason from grief?" Being able to speak with Elizabeth again filled me with such overwhelming emotion that every candle in the room flared simultaneously, providing dramatic confirmation of my presence that left no room for rational skepticism. Through tears of joy that she could not understand the source of, she listened as I explained the truth about my death and the ongoing investigation that would soon expose those responsible. But Elizabeth's joy at discovering that I still existed in some form was quickly tempered by horror as she learned the details of my murder. Her immediate impulse was to confront Charles directly, to demand justice for crimes she could now prove had been committed. Only my desperate insistence that premature action would alert the conspirators and allow them to escape prevented her from destroying Dr. Blackwell's careful investigation. "You must trust Dr. Blackwell," I pleaded with her. "He has spent months building a case that will expose not only my killers, but the entire organization they represent. If we act too quickly, we risk allowing other murderers to escape and continue claiming victims." Elizabeth's agreement to remain silent required tremendous restraint on her part, but her love for me and her understanding that justice required patience rather than immediate satisfaction convinced her to support Dr. Blackwell's methodical approach. She agreed to remain at Ravenshollow Manor as long as necessary, providing an additional witness to any suspicious activities while maintaining the appearance of a grieving sister completing necessary arrangements. Her presence also provided Dr. Blackwell with a living ally who could act upon information that I could gather but could not personally report to the authorities. Through Elizabeth, I could share details about the hidden correspondence in Charles's secret study, the location of Miss Thorne's concealed resources, and most importantly, the schedule for meetings between Miss Thorne and her contacts from London. These meetings, I had discovered, occurred regularly in the abandoned chapel on the grounds of Ravenshollow Manor, a location that provided privacy for discussions that could not be conducted within the main house. Miss Thorne received her instructions, reported on progress, and collected payment for services rendered during these clandestine gatherings. Dr. Blackwell arranged for official surveillance of these meetings, positioning investigators where they could observe and document the participants without revealing the source of their information. Through this surveillance, they were able to identify several key members of the murder organization and begin building cases against them that extended far beyond the specific crime of my death. But as Dr. Blackwell's investigation expanded to encompass the larger conspiracy, Miss Thorne began to demonstrate the survival instincts that had allowed her to operate successfully for years without detection. She sensed that the net was closing around her, though she could not identify the specific source of the threat. Her response was to accelerate the timeline for her planned marriage to Charles, pushing for an immediate ceremony that would legalize her position and provide her with the social protection of Duchess status before any accusations could be brought against her. She convinced Charles that extended mourning was unnecessary given the depth of their mutual affection and the comfort they could provide each other during their shared grief. The announcement of their engagement, made barely 3 months after my death, shocked even the social circles that were accustomed to flexible interpretations of propriety. But it also provided Dr. Blackwell with the final element he needed to demonstrate the premeditated nature of my murder, clear evidence that my death had been planned specifically to clear the way for a predetermined replacement. As the date for their wedding approached, I found myself facing a terrible dilemma. Dr. Blackwell's investigation had gathered sufficient evidence to arrest the conspirators, but the timing of the arrests would determine whether justice would be complete or whether some participants might escape to continue their deadly business elsewhere. More personally, I was beginning to understand that my growing solidity and presence in the physical world was not a permanent condition, but rather a temporary intensification of spiritual energy that was building toward some kind of resolution. Lady Margaret warned me that spirits could not maintain strong connections to the physical realm indefinitely. Eventually, we must either return fully to life, which was impossible, or accept transition to whatever realm awaited beyond the earthly sphere. My deepening love for Dr. Blackwell made the prospect of this final transition almost unbearable, even though I understood that our relationship could never develop into the conventional romance that either of us might have desired under different circumstances. We had found perfect communion of mind and spirit, but the physical separation between life and death remained an obstacle that even the strongest love could not overcome. Yet as I stood in the chapel where Miss Thorne would soon attempt to complete her victory over my memory by marrying my husband, I realized that some forms of justice required sacrifice, and some forms of love could only be expressed through the willingness to let go. The time was approaching when I would need to choose between clinging to my spiritual existence and ensuring that the truth about my murder would prevent future tragedies. The choice, when it came, would require every ounce of courage I possessed and would test whether love truly could triumph over death, when the price of victory was eternal separation from the one person who had seen my soul and found it worth saving. The morning of Charles's wedding to Miss Thorne dawned with the peculiar stillness that often precedes momentous events, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. I stood at the window of what had once been my bedroom, watching the early preparations unfold in the courtyard below, and felt the weight of finality settling upon me like a shroud woven from moonlight and determination. Dr. Blackwell had positioned his investigators throughout the village and the manor grounds, ready to act upon the evidence that months of careful investigation had accumulated. The timing was crucial. They needed to allow the wedding ceremony to proceed far enough to demonstrate the premeditated nature of the conspiracy, but not so far as to legitimize Miss Thorne's position as the new Duchess of Ravenshollow. The moment when Charles would be asked to pledge his faith to the woman who had helped murder his previous wife would provide the dramatic revelation that would ensure maximum legal and social impact. But as the morning progressed, I became increasingly aware that something within my spiritual essence was changing in ways that Lady Margaret had warned me to expect, but which I had not fully understood until I began to experience them directly. My form was becoming less substantial, my connection to the physical realm growing tenuous, as if the approaching resolution of my earthly concerns was allowing me to release the intensity of purpose that had anchored my spirit to Ravenshollow Manor. "It is time," Lady Margaret told me, as we stood together in the family chapel where generations of Ashworth marriages had been celebrated, and where today the final act of my story would unfold. "You have accomplished what you returned to do, and now you must decide whether to cling to this existence or to trust that justice will prevail without your continued presence." The choice she described was more complex than simply deciding between life and death, for I was already dead in any conventional sense. Rather, I was being asked to choose between maintaining my connection to the earthly realm through force of will and emotional attachment, or accepting transition to whatever lay beyond, trusting that the work I had begun would continue without me. The decision was made more difficult by my deepening love for Dr. Blackwell, a connection that had grown stronger with each passing day, despite the impossible circumstances of our relationship. During our final conversation the previous evening, he had expressed his own struggle with the knowledge that our time together was drawing to a close. "I have loved twice in my life," he had told me, his voice carrying the weight of a confession that cost him greatly to make. "Eleanor was the love of my youth, the partner I had hoped to grow old with in conventional happiness. But you, Catherine, you are the love of my soul, the connection that has taught me that death is not an ending, but a transformation. Losing you will be more difficult than losing Eleanor, because I know now what it means to love completely without reservation or the expectation of earthly fulfillment. His words had filled me with both joy and anguish, for they expressed exactly what I felt but could never hope to resolve. We had found perfect love under impossible circumstances, and now we faced the necessity of sacrifice that true love sometimes requires, the willingness to let go in order to serve something greater than our personal happiness. As the wedding guests began to arrive at Ravenshollow Manor, I moved through the gathering like a whisper of wind, observing the final assembly of players in the drama that would soon reach its conclusion. Charles appeared nervous but determined, playing his role as a man who had found comfort in the arms of someone who understood his grief. Miss Thorne was radiant with triumph, dressed in ivory silk that had been purchased with money from my life insurance policies, wearing jewels that had belonged to previous duchesses of Ravenshollow who had met similarly suspicious ends. But beneath her composed exterior, I could sense her uneasiness. She was too experienced in deception not to recognize the signs that something was amiss. The unusual number of unfamiliar faces among the wedding guests, the presence of men whose observant demeanor suggested official rather than social purposes, and most significantly, Dr. Blackwell himself, whose attendance at the wedding had no obvious explanation, but whose reputation as an investigator of medical irregularities would have been known to anyone in her organization. The ceremony began with the traditional formalities conducted by a vicar who had been carefully selected for his willingness to overlook the unusual haste of the proceedings in exchange for a substantial contribution to his church's restoration fund. As Charles and Miss Thorne took their positions at the altar, I stationed myself where I could observe not only the ceremony, but also the positioned investigators who would soon transform celebration into arrest. The first portion of the service proceeded without incident, with Charles speaking his vows with convincing emotion, and Miss Thorne responding with the perfect balance of joy and solemn commitment that the occasion demanded. But as the vicar reached the portion of the ceremony that called for any objections to the union, Dr. Blackwell rose from his position among the guests. "I object to this marriage," he announced in a voice that carried clearly throughout the chapel, "on the grounds that it is based upon criminal conspiracy, and specifically upon the murder of the groom's previous wife." The reaction from the assembled guests was immediate and dramatic, with gasps of shock, confused murmurs, and the kind of social chaos that results when unthinkable accusations are made in settings where such things simply do not occur. Charles's face went white with genuine surprise. Clearly, Miss Thorne had not warned him that their crimes might be discovered, while Miss Thorne herself maintained her composure with the practiced skill of someone who had prepared for this possibility. But as Dr. Blackwell began to present his evidence, supported by the testimony of investigators who had been observing the manor for weeks, Miss Thorne's facade finally cracked. Her transformation from blushing bride to cold professional was so complete and sudden that even those who had known her as a gentle governess could not mistake the true nature of the woman they had welcomed into their social circle. "You have no authority to make such accusations," she declared, abandoning the soft voice and deferential manner that had characterized her public persona. "This is a private ceremony, and your presence here is both unwelcome and legally meaningless." Dr. Blackwell's response demonstrated the thoroughness of his preparation. "I am here as a representative of the Royal College of Physicians, investigating irregularities in medical practice that have resulted in multiple deaths. I am also here with writs of arrest issued by magistrates in both Yorkshire and London, based upon evidence that will be presented in court." As he spoke, the investigators positioned throughout the chapel revealed themselves, surrounding Charles, Miss Thorne, and Dr. Pemberton with the methodical efficiency of professionals who had coordinated such operations before. The guests, realizing that they were witnessing the exposure of crimes rather than attending a wedding, began to understand why so many unfamiliar faces had been present among them. But Miss Thorne was not prepared to surrender without attempting to salvage something from the wreckage of her plans. As the investigators approached, she reached into her reticule and withdrew a small vial that I recognized from my spiritual investigations as containing the same poison that had been used to kill me. "If I cannot have the life I planned," she announced with chilling calm, "then I will choose the manner of my death, and I will not go alone. Her intention to poison herself, and as many others as possible, in a final act of destructive spite, galvanized my spiritual energy in ways that I had not experienced since my death. The threat to Dr. Blackwell, to Elizabeth, who sat among the guests, to innocent people who had simply come to witness what they believed was a wedding, triggered every protective instinct I possessed. Drawing upon reserves of spiritual strength that I had not known I commanded, I manifested with such sudden intensity that every person in the chapel could see me as clearly as if I had walked through the doors as a living woman. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Gasps of horror, cries of recognition from those who had known me in life, and most satisfying of all, a look of absolute terror on Miss Thorne's face as she realized that her victim had returned to claim justice. "You will not harm these people," I declared, my voice carrying with supernatural clarity throughout the chapel. "Your crimes are exposed, your conspiracy is ended, and your victims are finally able to speak the truth you tried so hard to silence." The vial fell from Miss Thorne's nerveless fingers, shattering on the stone floor of the chapel and spilling its deadly contents where they could harm no one. In her shock at my sudden appearance, she had lost the composure that had been her greatest weapon, and the investigators were able to secure her without further resistance. Charles, seeing me standing there in the chapel where he had once pledged to love and protect me, broke completely. His confession poured forth in a torrent of guilt, fear, and desperate attempts to minimize his own culpability by blaming Miss Thorne's influence and his own financial desperation. But his words only served to confirm the evidence that Dr. Blackwell had already gathered, providing additional details about the conspiracy that would ensure comprehensive prosecution of all involved parties. Dr. Pemberton, faced with the supernatural confirmation of crimes he had helped conceal, suffered what appeared to be a complete nervous collapse, babbling about gambling debts and threats that had forced his cooperation. His testimony, when he eventually recovered enough to provide it coherently, would prove crucial in identifying other medical professionals who had been corrupted by the same organization. As the immediate crisis resolved and the criminals were taken into custody, I found myself facing the final choice that Lady Margaret had warned me would come. My sudden manifestation had required an enormous expenditure of spiritual energy, and I could feel my connection to the earthly realm weakening with each passing moment. Dr. Blackwell approached the place where I stood, his eyes filled with the love and loss that had defined our impossible relationship. Around us, the chaos of arrests and confused guests continued, but for that moment we existed in a space that seemed separate from the ordinary world. "Must you go?" he asked, though I could see in his expression that he already knew the answer. "Justice has been served," I replied, feeling the truth of those words resonate through every fiber of my being. "The conspiracy is exposed, future victims will be protected, and you have the evidence needed to ensure that the organization responsible will be destroyed. My purpose here is complete." But saying goodbye to the only man who had ever truly seen and loved my soul was more difficult than facing death had been. We had found perfect communion across the boundary between life and death, only to lose it when that boundary could no longer be maintained. "I will never forget you," Dr. Blackwell promised, his voice breaking with emotion he could no longer contain. "And I will continue the work we began together, ensuring that no other women suffer as you and Eleanor suffered." Elizabeth approached us then, tears streaming down her face as she realized that this reunion would also be our final farewell. "Thank you for trusting me with the truth," she whispered, "and for showing me that love truly can transcend death." As my form began to fade, becoming translucent and ethereal once more, I felt not sorrow, but profound peace. I had been granted the extraordinary privilege of witnessing justice for my own murder, of protecting others from the fate I had suffered, and of experiencing a love that proved the soul's capacity for connection beyond all earthly limitations. Lady Margaret appeared beside me, her own form beginning to fade as well. "We have completed our work here," she said with satisfaction. "The cycle has been broken, the guilty have been exposed, and the innocent have been protected. Now we can rest." Looking back at Dr. Blackwell one final time, I felt the certainty that our connection would endure beyond this parting. Love that pure, that complete, does not simply end, because the beloved must move beyond earthly existence. In whatever realm awaited me, I would carry with me the memory of someone who had seen past the boundaries of life and death to love the essence of who I truly was. The last thing I saw as my spirit finally released its hold on Ravenshollow Manor was Dr. Blackwell placing a bouquet of white roses on the altar where Miss Thorne had planned to complete her victory over my memory. Instead of witnessing the triumph of evil, that altar had become the place where truth had finally prevailed and where love had proved stronger than death. The grandfather clock in the manor hall chimed midnight, marking not an ending, but a transformation. My murder had been solved, my murderers had been brought to justice, and the organization that had claimed so many innocent lives had been exposed and destroyed. Most importantly, I had learned that death is not the opposite of love, but rather its ultimate expression, the willingness to sacrifice everything, even existence itself, to protect what matters most. And in the London laboratory, where Dr. Blackwell would continue his work, developing new methods for detecting poisons and investigating suspicious deaths, a single white rose would always sit upon his desk, a reminder that some partnerships transcend the boundaries of life and death, and that justice, once awakened, can never again be silenced. The Duke had indeed held his lover close while his wife's spirit took her last breath alone. But that spirit had not remained alone for long, and in the end, it was love, not the selfish passion that leads to murder, but the selfless devotion that leads to sacrifice, that had ensured the final victory belonged to truth rather than deception. In the village churchyard where my earthly remains lay buried beneath a marble angel, fresh flowers appeared each week throughout the remaining years of Dr. Blackwell's life, placed there by hands that the living could not see but which maintained a connection that death had been powerless to sever. And on quiet evenings, when the Yorkshire mist clung to the ancient stones and the boundary between worlds grew thin, those with eyes to see might glimpse two figures walking together among the graves. A reminder that love, once pure and true, becomes eternal in ways that transcend every earthly limitation. The mystery was solved, the romance fulfilled in ways deeper than flesh could express, and justice had triumphed through the combined efforts of the living and the dead. It was, as all the best stories should be, an ending that was also a beginning, the start of a new chapter in a love story that would continue beyond the boundaries of any single lifetime.